Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to our next session of reading Aristotle's Politics. We are still in Book 5. We've just finished, today we're looking at Chapter 8. We just finished what is considered the first part of Book 5, which deals on the causes of change, political change, metabole, or revolution, is often translated. And Aristotle has given this at the end of chapter 7. He wraps up with his discussion of looking at the way change and stasis causing that change, or strife, political strife, or factional conflict, causes change, and the changes that happen, and the kind of regimes that are remaining in his analysis. In chapter 5, he dealt with democracy. In chapter uh, uh, 6, he dealt with oligarchy. And in chapter 8, he dealt with, oh, sorry, no, um, yeah, 5 was chapter 5 was clearly democracy. 6 was oligarchy, and 7 was both regime, or often translated by polity. And remember, polity is politeia, so it's the same word as regime or constitution. So it's the regime called regime, right? That and so-called aristocracy, which he blurs it again. As I mentioned, which is something common he does. He always, even in book 4, in the chapters that are supposed to be dedicated to so-called polity, that is chapters uh, 7, 8, and 9 in book 4, he constantly doesn't give a separate treatment of either not democracy. Sorry, he does do that, but doesn't give a separate treatment of regime called regime of polity on its own. He kind of always immediately contrasts or braces the question of so-called aristocracy, and because he argues it's a blending. But then we have to remember all regimes, as chapter beginning first part of chapter 4 always makes it clear that which he introduces his examination of the variations of democracy, that all regimes are composed of parts, right? All cities are the parts, and that it's and a regime is an arrangement of the parts, particularly one of those parts exercising authority and ruling over the whole. So, so therefore, every regime is kind of, say, mixed in that sense. You cannot escape being blended. The problem is we could say that democracy and oligarchy are pure types, defined by the principle of, can say defined by the principle of either the people or the few, right? That's the demos, which is the multitude, or the people, the demos, the people, the many, hoi polloi, or the ogoi, the few, right? That's the principle. And the oligarchy means rule the few, literally, but at the same time, Aristotle defines it as being the few, in the sense the rich, right? I always return to this because I want people to always remember this, because this is now we're turning away from his account of this. Last chapter, he was kind of just dealing with that aspects of how those regimes vary in this, and he doesn't really, he blurs it again, and he actually makes a lot of general points about all regimes, the tendencies of all regimes in that sense, and I think that's very interesting. He ends his account now in chapter 7, ends the account of factional conflict and change, metabolic. He ends that. And now he moves at 8 to a new concept, and it says right here. Well, let's start. We have next to speak about preserving regimes, politeia, both in common and separately for each sort. So we're going to look at the question of How do we preserve regimes in that sense? Um, I, as there, okay, and this is interesting. Um, in my notes on this chapter, I will argue that there's 10 specific discussions about, in general, okay, this is the argument he's going to talk first in general, then specific, right? So that's what he says here. Now, in the first place, it is clear that we have an understanding of the things that destroy them. So we have to have a clear understanding of what destroys regime. And we dealt with that. That's what the clear things. Um, we have also have an understanding of the things that preserve them. For opposites are productive of opposite things. The destruction and destruction is the opposite of preservation. So what therefore to understand something, an action or an activity may lead to either, in some situations, in some cases, it may lead to destroying a regime, destroying it, as he says, undermining it, destroying it, or making it weaker, making it less strong, less secure, less stable. And as being unstable, it becomes weaker and more likely to, you know, be susceptible to change, right? This is something he said, that something that's regimes that have concord are less susceptible to change in that sense, or have their regime changed in that sense. But it's less susceptible, not immune, because accidents can happen. In other words, changes can happen as well as accidentally, he says. So, and therefore, you have to look at what preserves and what destroys. Now, we've paid attention to what the previous chapters, the three previous chapters looked at the questions of the factors that what destroy regimes, in the particular regimes. And the whole question, the early chapters, the first four chapters, dealt with the general principles, and then, books 1, 2, 3, and 4, chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 by 5, dealt with the general principles of what leads to change and why a stasis emerges. And 5, 6, and 7 gave us specific cases in the specific regimes. Now we're talking about preservation, and therefore the question of what preserves it. Now, so therefore, and the question of the opposites, the opposite activity of it. The argument is the first position, the opposite of something. So something that in this, if this thing activity leads it to change in that regime, then the antithesis of that action, or doing the opposite of that action, or will produce the opposite effect, or hopefully, in that sense. In that sense, in other words, opposites are productive of opposite things, and destruction is the opposite of preservation, right? So therefore, once we understand, the argument here is, the implicit argument here is, once we understand the causes of change, we can understand the means of preservation. This is why constantly in the discussion of the change, he is often once in a while given hints of preservation. So therefore, some people argue, oh, this account is not complete, this is not filled. And it is. We have a problem here. But that's because he's kind of given us in the past. So therefore, we have to go back and reflect what he said earlier, different parts, because earlier portions he have already given us some suggestions of how to preserve a regime. So this is why this chapter is kind of a frustrating one for many people and scholars, because it requires us to constantly go back to things. But at the same time, it's a nice, simple thing. You'll say. So let's continue. He'll talk about next thing is, in well blended regimes, then one should watch out to ensure that no transgressions of the laws, and above all else to be on guards against the small ones. Transgression of the laws slipping unnoticed, just as small expenditures consume a person's property when frequently repeated. The expenditure goes unnoticed because it does not happen all at once. The mind is led to reason fallaciously by this, and sophistical as the in the sophistical arguments, if each is small, so are all, right? That's each, if everything is small, if these are small, then all are small. This is so in one sense, but in another sense, not. The whole and all things are not to something small, but are composed of small things. Now, this is the footnote 74, sorry. I think this is a reference to, yeah. The expression was commonly referred to the world and the universe, right? This is the whole, the cosmos. When all things, the whole, and the whole and all thing, the cosmos, um, uh, uh, are not something are not something small, but are composed of small things. So therefore, this is the whole idea. In other words, the problem in blending is the transgression, a transgression of the law. The transgressions are usually small ones. It's the small transgressions. And again, notice the thing of small. The small things constantly refer. Now, the small things in four were often trivial things of personal habits or misdeeds, to these slights of either sexual or a lot of them sexual or marital aspects. Uh, we would say, "Oh, picayunies, why does it matter?" But it does. Small things matter. Small things can be the cause of bigger things. And he's saying that this is the danger. You have to pay attention to the small things. It's because like expenditures, you can, in other words, you make a mistake. You have this fallacy of thinking that everything's a small, we can survive. It's a small things, the small stuff we can survive. No, because why? Because the small stuff builds up over time and accumulates. This is why, like a little bit of snow may not be that, but if it's constant and there's no heat and it doesn't melt, it can accumulate a lot. Okay, that's deceptive. That's the deceptive one. Well, if it's coming down heavy, we expect it to accumulate. It's when it's coming down very lightly, we don't expect it to accumulate, and that's the deceptive character of what he's talking about here. And that the problem again, he ends it on this. He ends that line on the thing of that. Well, it's the universe is made of the universe itself is not small. Everything in the whole is not small, but it's made up of small things. Okay, that's the whole point. Now, one must be on guard in the first instant, then, against this sort of arche, beginning point, arche. Be on guard on it. Next, one should not trust to those things that have been devised against the multitude, for they are thoroughly refuted by the facts as to which sort of devices in the regime we mean. This was spoken of earlier. Now, 75 here, this refers to the devices at chapter 13 of book 4, paragraphs 1 to 5. These the terms devices is sophomasia or sophistic schemes. These devices. In my my notebook on this, I have a nice graph on this. The sophistic schemes in chapter 13, right? In chapter 13, yes. Yeah, that's that wonderful guy. He says there's oligarchy democratic devices, right? These are the devices that they use against the peoples. The devices, mostly the oligarchy devices, right? And he looks at the different areas that against the assemblies, the offices, the courts, the armaments, and the question of exercises, activities. Now, why is that important? Because I think it's a very he's saying here that we should be on the watch out against these devices, those who do these devices. In other words, they're refuted. He said that is very interesting. He says that the facts refute them in that sense. That it's kind of what's the devices against the multitude. They don't work, and they're very dangerous. Okay, they backfire. He seems to suggest, but not only in 13, but elsewhere. Okay, we have to remember that even in book 3, he warns against the exclusion of the demos from the city in that sense as being unsafe. That's why we could say when later that he doesn't have he removes the demos from participating in the city of his best city, should raise eyebrows, given the warning that he gives in book 3. Um, so continue. Let's continue now. Further, one should see that not only some aristocracies, but even some oligarchies last, not because the regimes are stable, but because those occupying the offices treat well those outside the regime, as well as those in the governing body, okay, the polituma, right? Those who do not have a part, by not by acting unjustly towards them, and by bringing into the regime those among them who have the marks of a leader, not acting unjustly towards the ambitious by depriving them of prerogatives, or towards the many with regard to profit, and themselves and those who have a part by treating one another in a popular spirit. So this is the see. In other words, oligarchies and aristocracies, they have a danger. He warned it earlier. These are a problem. The fewness of them makes it problem. It's dangerous. The fewness of the regime makes it liable to be able to cause problems. Right. This is something he raised both in chapter 7 with regard to the question of aristocracies and the so-called aristocracies, and the earlier chapter 6 about oligarchies. Their fewness is one of their weak spots. Okay, the fewness of ruling, fewness of office, and the tendency of the few to want to become fewer, which then creates a dynastic. The Greek word dynastics, dynasty, a dynastic rule, which Lord in his translation called rule of the powerful. I think that's a bad. I think dynastic rule is a better term here. It means that it becomes those holding power become few. A very a clique of the brothers and families and certain families, very small. And he actually warns about the regime within the regime, right? An oligarchy within the oligarchy being something very unstable. Therefore, if you treat the people well, you let those, in other words, you don't harm the many from the profit. They're able to make profit. They're able to live their lives. Again, Machiavelli's famous thing: don't touch their women or their property, right? Don't, I mean, by women, that means don't touch their honor, don't touch their sense of, don't be arrogant toward them, don't aggrandize them to a degree that belittles them. But among the ruling class, people who are supposed to be in the ruling part, who are supposed to be part of the consumer, but not necessarily exercising the offices, treat them with respect as well. So those who are part of the ruling body but may not be holding offices or get into the offices, don't hold them badly also. Treat them as equals. Okay, now this is what you say here. For the equality that those of the popular sort seek for the multitude is not only just but advantageous for persons who are similar. So in other words, it's not only just that the equality that the multitude seeks, but it's also advantageous, he says here, but those who are similar. Now, for those who are unsimilar, it's not advantageous, you would argue, the logic is. But for those who are similar, therefore the equality, therefore even in a in other words, an aristocratic or slash oligarchic regime, there needs to be some treatment of equals. There needs to be some equality among the people who are equal, or this will create stasis, conflict. Okay, and that's the thing he's trying to point to here, right? Hence, when there are a number of persons in the polituma, the governing body, many legislative measures of a popular sort are advantageous. So therefore, if there's a number of persons in the governing body, legislative measures of a popular sort are advantageous, such as having offices for 6 months, or that all those who are similar may take part in them. So therefore, those who can are similar or same. Um, for similar persons are already a people, as it were, and hence popular leaders often arise among them, as said earlier. Right, this is 76. Here again, back in chapter 6, 5 through 6, right? This is about oligarchy, the danger of oligarchy. That in an oligarchy there is the tendency of all of a sudden the people will be there, and that they will that elite popular people will emerge, right? Oligarchies and aristocracies will then be less apt to decline into rule of the dynastic rule. This is the power of dynastic rule. For it is not easy for a ruler to act as badly in a short time than over a long one. So again, this is reduce the times. Reduce the times. Don't have long terms of office. Long terms of office leads to what? People to forget the thing. People to kind of get you. That's the thing about long terms. Long terms, um, uh, 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 people get angry if the term's long. Okay, therefore, what do? You do your bad. You do your bad stuff. Do the things that are going to harm and piss off everybody in the beginning of your term. If it's like a 5 year, a 4 year, 5 year term, a 6 year term, right? Do you make all your change in the first 2 years, and you have 4 years for people to forget about it, and maybe you do things nice for things in the last 2 years you OD on the flattery and the nice things, right? So therefore that's the danger of long terms. Therefore, if you want to prevent abuse or bad behavior on the hands of rulers, you have shorter terms. This is why the Romans always had 1 year, right? 1 year. We would think, oh my God, only 1 year. But that's the idea that you hold the people accountable. That's why the Greeks often only had half-year to 1 year terms, right? So that there would be constantly accountability. So the term would allow for the accountability and prevent what? Prevent things in that sense. Um, Indeed, it is on this account that tyrannies arise in oligarchies and democracies. Okay, this is because why? In other words, the idea that, in other words, when officers have long periods of time, the ruler has long offices. In other words, therefore, either the oligarchy creates a dominant power of the powerful who are not accountable, and the mob rules unaccountably, the last democracy, right? For those who aim at tyranny in either regime are either the greatest persons, the popular leaders in one, and the powerful, the dynastic leaders, in the other, or those who hold the greatest offices when they rule for a longer time. So if you're going to have in other words, the danger in a democracy or an oligarchy is the rise of the dynasty, the power all being held in a hand for a very few people, and hold it for a long time. And likewise, the popular leader in a democracy, the demagogue, right? The popular leader. Remember, demagogue just means popular leader. Um, um, what is this? They hold power, and they're not accountable. They're not being checked in that sense, or not being removed from office. Therefore, what happens is this is why this leads to their power, and this is leads to tyranny in both those the last democracy and the last oligarchy. And also any office, an office that allows it to have a very long time of office, there's always a risk that this person is going to act like a tyrant in that sense. Regimes are preserved not only on account of the things that destroy them being distant, but sometimes also through them being nearby. In other words, regimes are not only preserved not only on account of the things that destroy them being distant, but nearby. What do you mean? What the danger? In other words, for when men are afraid, they get a better grip on the regime. In other words, understand, fear. Fear is not only a thing that causes a reaction at bad things, but fear can also be a force for making you realize there's a danger and you take care of it. In other words, this is why courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the application of reasoning about fear. It's right reasoning regarding fear, so that your action towards it is proper, right? That's why it's a virtual arete, right? So therefore, this is the same thing here. Fear is a useful thing in this situation. So the things that can destroy the regime or a threat to the regime are make them. Yeah, not, it's not, people say, oh, the danger should be threats should be far away. when threats are far away, people are not paying attention. It's when the threat is right before their eyes. But sometimes that's too late. But if you can, in other words, this is why. Thus, those who take thought for the regime should promote fears, so that they will defend, not overturn the regime, keeping watch on it like an eternal God, and make the faraway near. The nocturnal God, the nocturnal guardians. Again, there's a kind of a reference to Plato's laws, the nocturnal council, right? In Plato's laws, the discussion of the council, right? But there, it's only going to be people speaking and doing things. Here, this is the watching of the regime, that they're paying attention, right? Nocturnal guards here are those who what? Promote fear. Why? Because and this encourages people to defend, not overturn the regime. And what they're doing is to make the far away near. Next, further, one should try to guard against rivalries and factional conflicts of notables. In other words, stasis of the notables, both through laws and by guarding against those who are outside the rivalry getting caught up in it themselves. For to recognize an ill as it arises in the beginning belongs not to an ordinary person, but rather to a man expert. Again, this is that wonderful line right from the Prince. This is the princess, here the prince is all over the place. We hear things of Machiavelli constantly in this line. This is the case. This is that metaphor that it's catch the a sickness can be more effectively dealt if you catch it early, because when sometimes certain diseases, when you know what they are, it's too late, and the remedies are usually worse than can kill the patient, right? Well, this is the point about this. The rivalries and conflicts, the rivalries and the stasis, factional conflict of the notables. This can destroy a regime, as he said in the last two chapters, right? This is so. Therefore, take care about this. Not only laws, but also what? Making sure that outside people, not the outsiders, don't get caught up and want to participate in that rivalry. Okay? Okay? In other words, come on. Entertainment TV is bad. All gossip. In other words, what happens? We see the rich and famous in their fights, and the danger here is that we get caught up in it and we participate, and therefore this can lead to a leader manipulating the people's attachment and that things. Again, this is the nature of politics, both for good or bad. So if you're going to prevent this, and you have to prevent the uh, 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 make sure that the people, in other words, that those outside the rivalry getting caught up in it themselves. In other words, don't allow the rivalry to spread into society. Because if it spreads into the society, then it's out of the stasis that's here, the conflict that's here, will spread, metastasize in the whole. And therefore, it's easier to deal with at this level. It's going to be possible to deal with at the latter level. Next, with regard to revolution, a change, with regard to the change, revolution from oligarchy and regime that occurs on account of assessments, right? Remember that thing about assessments. That would happen. Remember, he said accidental things, that assessments happen, and that there's an assessment at the beginning, and prosperity happens. So therefore, this regime went from an oligarchy regime, or a regime called regime, the so-called polity, to a more popular rule, because more people can make the assessment because the property values increased because of prosperity. So that whole thing about assessment, right? When this happens, while the assessment remains the same, but the money becomes abundant, it is advantageous to investigate what the amount of the common assessment is compared to with that of the past in cities which assess every year on the basis of that period, and larger ones every third or fourth year. And if the amount is many times greater or less than before at a time when the assessment rates for the regime were established, to have a law that tightens or relaxes the assessment. If the total current amount exceeds the old, tighten the assessment in proportion to the increase. If it foreshorts, relax the rate of assessments by making it less. So, in other words, what are we saying here? How do you avoid this? Well, you avoid this by compare what the rates were and to see what the things were and what is the rate of, if it's a question of money supply, if it's a question that the assessment is based because of the money supply, the money's the question of this, and how do you do it? This is the way. This is flex. This is kind of an accounting. Pay attention to the money and the rate, and then try to manipulate it. Right. If this is not done in oligarchies and regimes, regimes called regimes, or so-called polities, the result in the one case is that the latter and oligarchy in the latter, these oligarchies arise, and the former, the rule of the powerful. In other words, um, the danger is that the dynastic rule, right? And while in the case, in the other case, a democracy arises from polity and from an oligarchy to a regime, a polity or rule of the people. Now, here's 78. Here, the words kai et monarchia are omitted. Now, this is why Drenza and Brack under the gloss probably right in that sense. There's a problem with en monarchia here, in monarchy. And actually, maybe even monarchy in that sense. This is a rule of the people in monarchy. Okay, um, um, the idea of why monarchy. This is the problem. Is it right to raise monarchy here? Um, uh, Drenzer brackets it. The term he drops it completely. Lord does. Um, but in this, remember the tendency here. If we don't deal with the property issue, right? If it, in other words, if the problem gets this way, if the change happens in one sense that uh, the, the, the wealth and things increase, but then people are a few only benefit of it, and they tighten it up. That creates the regime of the so-called dynasty, right? Or makes it Richard's oligarchy. This is how the regime turns from one type of oligarchy to a more dynastic oligarchy, and from a regime called regime to an oligarchy, right? And then the danger is the opposite situation, right? The opposite is from a oligarchy to a democracy, or from a regime, a politea, called politea, polity, a democracy arise. If it weakens or it becomes more expanded or something, more people can participate, and then from an oligarchy can either change from a polity regime called regime or the rule of the people, right? Okay. Now he even says a monarchy. Now this is an interesting thing. I would maybe suggest that monarchy comes up with the other case, the rule of the powerful or monarchy, right? But that could be the thing, that the monarchy might be the monarchy in the Greek text might refer to this aspect, the first case, not the latter case. Remember, Greek, the way the Greek and the grammar of the Greek is, sometimes the question is what's that being referred to? That might just be a text. That may be out of there for effect, a sound for the sound in the Greek, and that the grammar of it might point to the earlier account. So I think that's possible, that this is the danger of not only the rule of the powerful or the dynastic, but a monarchy as well. Isn't that a danger in an oligarchy? An oligarchy that becomes more small, more powerful, and which these powerful people emerge, and then not only it becomes, isn't the monarchy, if a dynastic is a few within the few, is not the fewest number one, a monarchy, right? So now this is the next point, right? It is a common thing to rule the people in oligarchy, and okay, that's why I made the mistake. Sorry. Yeah, okay, yeah, this is my error. I apologize. The previous note was about deflationary, inflationary. The monarchy was not here. This is where he left the monarchy. Now, one person's brackets it say they should not be here. I think that's right. I think so. If I was my, I'm reading the text wrong in that sense. I'm reading the text wrong in the sense that I'm following. I misread the footnote, so I apologize. That's my oops, bad boy. They didn't change anything. I think that's right here. Now here is that this is that is common for the rule of the people and oligarchy, It is common to rule over people in oligarchy and to monarchy in every regime not to allow any person to grow overly great contrary to proportion, but to attempt to give um, small prerogatives over a long period of time rather than great ones quickly. For Now, I'm going to stop here for a second. I think, okay, this is where the monarchy, right? I think this is true. Now, it's a common thing to rule of people, oligarchy, and monarchy in every regime, not to allow any person to grow great contrary to proportion. This is the danger of the person growing great, too big. It means they're going to challenge, they're going to have power, they're going to, because why? But attempt to give small prerogatives over a long period of time rather than great ones quickly. Now, this is 80, or possibly the net translation, but rather to attempt to give small prerogatives over a long period of time or great ones briefly, reading branchly instead of take, quickly. That could be two, take, brakte. That could be a type, brake, instead of the manuscript. It is also conceivable that something has dropped out of the text here, something is missing from the text. So therefore, it can be you can read it in two ways. The idea is it could be a typo here, take, in the Greek quickly, could be read brake, which means quickly, briefly. Sorry, briefly. Sorry. Um, so that rather than very briefly, for they become corrupted. If it does not belong to every man to bear good fortune. Okay, this is the lottery thing. Not every person can handle good fortune. This is why a lot of people who get lotteries, their lives are worse. Okay, that's because you think you got some good fortune can be a curse if you don't know how to handle it. That's the point. They become corrupted. In other words, or failing this, at least not to give them all at the same time, and then take it back all at the same time, but rather gradually. In other words, you give them. In other words, if you're going to do things, it's better to do it gradually. It's not to give them power and then take it back. This might cause resentment, might cause anger, might okay. You had this great power. You think, oh my God, now I'm taking it back, and all of a sudden, oh my God, your resentment occurs. Um, Above all, one should try to shape matters by the means of the laws, so that there arise no one especially preeminent by the power of his friends or riches, or failing this, that such persons have sojourns abroad, far away. 81. The meaning of the word parastasis, sojourns, is not entirely certain, though usually considered by some as a form of ostracism, right? It it could perhaps refer merely to official missions, such as embassies or military commands. But no, it can be going abroad. In other words, just trips away. In other words, the danger here is what? Someone who has This is a danger. Make the laws and make it very difficult for people to be able to exercise or get into because they have preeminence of power of his friends or his riches. Just prevent this. Try to prevent that these people get into positions of power. People have great friends. The shape matters by means of law, that there arise no one especially preeminent by the power of his friends or his riches. But failing these two things, have such if anyone make it difficult for people to get powerful because of their friends, or powerful because of their riches in the system, in the regime. Okay, and therefore, if you can't do this, these people who are powerful because they're friends, make them sure they're doing things overseas. Okay, since men also attempt subversion on account of their private lives. Okay, this is the private life problem, right? One should create an office to oversee those who live in a manner that is disadvantageous relative to the regime, in a democracy relative to the democracy, in an oligarchy relative to the oligarchy, and similar to each other regime. In other words, you need guardians of. You need someone to police the regime. Oh my God! The censors. Oh, yes. You don't want undemocratic activities. Should people who have undemocratic or behaviors that are dangerous to the regime should be paid attention to. Oh my God, what about the First Amendment? Well, yes, but the First Amendment assumes that people, I don't think there's a right, there's no First Amendment right to overthrow the regime. Unless, my George Anastopoulos says, yes, people have a right to overthrow the regime. So only in the idea that everyone has the right to overthrow the regime, but that's not that prudent to do that, right? Uh, um, uh, does one have a right to openly conspire to overthrow the regime? Only the most hardcore civil libertarians. Oh yes, as long as they don't act upon it. No, if they're actively, if someone is this is why it's right to arrest. If not arrest, then make their lives miserable. Communists and those who overthrow. This is the problem. This is when the communists rule. They make the lives of everyone else overthrow, horrible and miserable and things. So do it to them before they do it to you. Right? That's the logic. Yes, you better watch those who want to destroy the regime. You got to know who they are, and you got to police against them, and you got to discriminate against. Yes, that's going to make me. Try to get them to change their mind. But if you can't change their mind, you better guard against them, prevent them from ever holding responsibility, holding any places of trust. They shouldn't be teachers. They shouldn't be in charge of anything that can corrupt the system. You need to be watching out on this. This is the point. Aristotle. Oh my God, this is authoritarian. No, it's just. Duh. This is not authoritarian. This is why the idiocy we live in, the world of idiocies we live in by liberalism. Liberalism is kind of a HIV of the mind, which makes us believe all sorts of idiocies. Um, this is one of the problems here. That this is no. That sure you have to guard against those who are going to subvert the regime. This has to happen. You have to watch out for them. You have to protect against them. You should do it by law. And by law in broader sense, remember, law here is not only the written legal process, but also social norms, habits, customs, group, social habits, social customs. And for the same reason, the prospering of a part, the prospering of a part of the city, a community, should be guarded against. In other words, if one part just only prospers rather than the whole, a part prospers but not the whole, you should be on a guard against that. A remedy for this is always to place actions and offices in the hands of the opposing parts. I speak of the respectable as opposed to the multitude, and the poor as opposed to the well-off. Right? In other words, if all of a sudden we have a situation where the well-off get well-off, and have the poor have authority over regulating having the poor check and regulate the well-off, or when the people, the multitude of the vulgar get expanding in power or expanding of control, then have the multitude check them. This is the way we do it, checks and balances, right? And try either to mix together the multitude of the poor and that of the well-off, or to increase the middling element. For this dispels the factional conflict that results from inequality. In other words, if you try to mix them, in the case of work, you can try to mix them in a certain way, or increase the middle, the middling element, the middling element. This is that whole chapter 11 discussion about the mesos. The mesos are a multitude, but they have enough. They don't need more. So therefore, the poor is dangerous. Those who without anything want that goes back all the way to chapter 11 of book 4. The whole problem of the poor and the rich, right? And how the poor and the rich are disadvantageous. That leads to problems. That's why you should cultivate the mesos, the middle, right? That's what he says. Here, the middling element, this is for it dispels the factional conflict, the stasis, that results from inequality. But a very great thing, but a very great thing in every regime is to have the laws and the management of the rest arranged in such a way that it is impossible to profit from the offices. I would argue this is what's really wrong with America. That you shouldn't profit from the office. But we come on, the history of the friggin' New Deal left, the Democrats did this. Because they were poor people who came in and they became millionaires. Look at Nancy Pelosi. Come on, Pelosi's father was a politician and a city machine and a congressman, and that he became rich by what being a congressman. They get all these, and they get exempt from a lot of regulations and laws. So they get to break the law, and it doesn't apply to them. Rules don't apply to Congress in the same ways. That's dangerous. This is what Aristotle says is stupid. You know, this is why the New Deal was a kind of a destruction of the American regime to a great degree, because it undermined the regime. And all of a sudden, Democrats started making profit from office, and they become what? They become rich and powerful. And what they do, the party that's supposed to be the party of the workers, all of a sudden abandons them. They now becomes the party of tech firms and big business and banking. You see the irony here about this? This is something that should be looked after, particularly in oligarchies, right? This is what oligarchies. This will lead to conflict. Now, in oligarchies, you have to be careful that those who profit from the regime, okay, the many do not chafe as much at being kept away from ruling. They are even glad if someone leaves them the leisure for their private affairs, as as they do when they suppose that the rulers are stealing common funds. In other words, they don't mind. People won't mind not holding office and a lot of things, but they feel that their money, their tax money, is being stolen. Angry at them. Okay, cuts them off. When the This is why an oligarchy is problematic. This will energize the many against the rich. Okay. Um, um, then it pains them both not to partake in the prerogatives and not to share in the profits. Indeed, the only way it is possible for a democracy and an aristocracy to exist together is if someone institutes this. If someone institutes making it possible. In other words, you can have democracy and aristocracy only work is that if you can. In other words, the aristocratic element cannot profit and cannot lord it over. The many should be able to profit, and the many may not be able to partake in the offices, the ruling highest offices, but as long as they don't feel that their money, that common funds are being used to glorify the wealthy, the aristocracy, right? For it would then be possible for both the notables and the multitudes to have what they want. So remember, this is what the multitude wants to have. The multitude wants to be left alone. They want to be able to make profit. They want to be left alone and be able to make their money, make their activities, and enjoy, and not have the common funds abused. All right, which is they think is the part their part. Um, and what does the aristocrats want? To exercise, to do great things, to do things, exercise authority, exercise virtue, right? To rule. Okay, so therefore they get to both do what they want, as long as what the guard against them from making profit from it, and they're using common funds for their profit. Having it open to all to rule is character. In other words, having it open all to rule is characteristic of democracy. Everyone can rule is democratic. Having the not ables in the office is character. In other words, having the not ables in the offices, notable. Sorry, that's a type. Not ables, notable. There's a space that shouldn't be a space here. The notable having the notables in office is characteristic of aristocracy. So the notables are. It's only the notables, those who are the elites, those who are the better sort, the people who are the better educated, the better ruled, the better people. That's aristocratic. Elections are aristocratic in that sense. It reduces to a few, right? Um, This is the therefore everyone can hold office as democratic, and if it's only to the notables are in office. This is aristocratic, right? But this is what will happen when it is impossible to profit from the offices. The poor will not want to rule on account of not profiting, but rather will want to attend to their private affairs. The well off will be able to rule because they will need nothing from the common funds. The result for the poor is that they will become well off through spending their time at work. For the well off, that they will not be ruled by ordinary people. To prevent the stealing of common funds, then, let the transfers of funds uh, 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 occur in the way present of all citizens, and let records of this be deposited with each clan, company, or tribe, subunit or group, right? The term lacos is, in other words, yeah, 82. This is the term lacos is used tribe in military context, but here it refers to organization of the common messes, right? This idea of the small groups, the small organizations and the organizations in the political community, how they're doing it. The tribes is the not tribes is not the word tribes here are not meant to be the tribe as an ethnoi, but rather the, the political unit that a city is divided into. We would say what precinct or district or ward, right? But to ensure profitless rule, there should be legislation assigning honors to those with good reputation. So therefore, profit not through money, but through honors. In democracies, the well-off should be spared, not only by not having their possessions redivided, but not even their incomes, which in some regimes happen unnoticed. In other words, you better be careful. In democracies, be careful. Don't target the wealth. Not only don't target the wealth of the wealthy, but redistributing it. Not only you shouldn't be redistributing their capital, their property, their wealth itself, but also their incomes. Why? Because this creates them be angry. This hurts them. Okay, and sometimes which happens in regimes unnoticed. It is better to prevent them from taking on expenses but useless public services, such as leading courses, officiating torch races, and such similar things, even if they're willing. In other words, get them to engage in civil society and do things, do charitable works, do things like this. You get them to do that. Why? Because this is the way they don't take their money, but encourage them to do acts for the good of the community. Do you understand? Um, And in other words, that's for a democracy. Now, in oligarchy, on the other hand, much care should be taken of the poor, offices from which grain gains accrue, distribute to them. In other words, and if one of the well-off behaves arrogantly towards them, the penalty should be greater than if towards one of their own. In other words, wait a minute, this is the oligarchy. Okay, if there's any minor office that makes money that gives profit, give it to the poor, not to the rich. This is how you prevent the poor being envious. They profit. They are profit. So they participate in the offices, the minor offices that accrue wealth, profit, um, and they share. They not offended, and it should be done that they can all do. Be able to hold it. So therefore, it's uh, um, and offices which gains accrue to them. Now the question of if the well-off behave arrogantly, penalize them greater. More, penalty for aggrandizement against them should be higher. The penalties on the rich should be more than for the poor. Okay, when they arrogantly towards each other, right? Also, inheritance should be passed on not by bequests but on basis of family. and the same person should not receive more than one inheritance, limiting inheritance. If you're going to keep this oligarchies need to control inheritances to prevent what? To prevent either there's no inheritance and they become poor and they become or what? They're creating powerful, creating the dynasties. In this way, properties would be more on a level, and more of the poor could establish themselves among the well-off. Right? This is balancing. Right? This is the kind of balancing you need to do in oligarchy. So therefore, this is right here in this chapter, we're getting the discussion of balancing, in a sense, with democracies at first and oligarchies. But notice, polities and so-called aristocracies are not discussed. Notice that. Why? Well, the secret is because polities are really democracies and all so-called aristocracies are really oligarchies. And what's true for the one is true for the other. Right? That's the little dirty secret. So next thing, and it is advantageous both in a democracy and in an oligarchy to assign equality or precedent to those who share least in the regime, and the rule of the people to the well-off, and to an oligarchy the poor, in all respects, other than the authoritative offices of the regime. These should be kept in the hands only or mainly of those from the regime. So, in other words, of the offices, particularly, you should be allowing what? You should allow those who are not of the regime. This is advantageous. This is advantageous to both oligarchies and democracies. Assign equality or precedence to those who least share in the regime. So, in a rule of the people, right, the people are going to share more, and the rich, the well-off, are going to share less, right? So, therefore, well, you got to let them get something. Therefore, the rich, right, the well-off. In oligarchy, you have to make sure the poor get access to the regime. Now, all in respect to the office, in all respects, other than the authoritative officers, the most ruling offices, the authoritative officers that rule the regime. These need to be kept. These need to be kept in the hands, and mainly for those of the regime, and kept in the hands only. These should be kept in the hands only and or mainly of those from the regime. Those are the most of the regime that reflect the regime. Those who are really of that ruling part, that ruling element. And that ends our chapter 8, the first general account of this. But notice he started mixing it right away. His general account also, yes, that was a general account. We had, in my point, I would argue that there's 10. Let me just point this out here. I'll just look at it, my note here on this. I think it's useful to point out. There's 10 here. One, transgression against the laws or avoid that. Devices against the multitude. We talked about that too. 3, treating those outside the ruling power, Palatuma, by giving of the regime well. In other words, render justice to them properly. 4, okay, the first one, transgressions, avoid transgressions. 2, devices against the regime, don't do them, right? Against the multitude, don't do them. Notice against the multitude, not against the few in that sense, right? 3, treating those outside the regime, right? Treat them well. Keep dangerous things far away, or by making the things near, and feared by. In other words, make the close near, right? To do this. Next one to do also is 5 to do. Guard against rivalries amongst the notables, right? Particularly the elites, aka the elites. Prevent the rivalries. 6 is on account of assessment, so the problem with taxes and eligibility, right? This is to avoid that. This is something you can. Well, that's both do and avoid, right? That don't allow the assessments to go too out of control, and that you don't take care of them, right? to allow a person to grow contrary to proportions, right? Avoid this. Someone to become greater than they are, like that. That is a 7. 8, subversion on account of those private lives, again, avoid. And then 9 and 10, to do, right? That is, cannot profit from holding offices, and opponents to the regime should be spared and treated those terms, right? To the terms of those possessed goods. Now, the last part here, not only to be spared of their possessions and that, right? But also then he ends it even more, 21. It's advantageous to assign equality here, right? That's probably the 11th, and I think I missed it in my notes. Um, and again, this how ends the first account. So if you have any comments, I'm sorry if I made that little error earlier. You know, if you, so please, any comments or questions or issues that you came up in this reading of this, please put it down there, and when I see them, I'll respond to them. If you liked what you've seen and want to like it, okay, share it with your friends, share it on your social media, spread the word. If you have not subscribed, do subscribe because you get the notification. Encourage others to subscribe. Maybe you've seen it already, and that's all. I want to see this more. Next thing you can do is, well, if you don't like it, you can say no and just say why. Um, you can follow me on social media below if you want to help, if you want to contribute. This does cost money. This does cost things, expenses and things, and even buying books are now more expensive. So it'd be nice that if someone helps. I need a patron. I need a benefactor. I just looked at my money for the month and I cried. Um, this is silly. I hate to say that. Another way you can, so therefore, Patreon subscribe star, you can say, well, you don't do anything. Well, there's no one there. Okay, once there's someone there, and I have a demand, I will deliver. I'm a good worker. Um, um, and I think my services are worthy of something. Another way you can help is buy my book. Um, I kind of pointed this today a little bit already. This is my a little thing called Notebook on Aristotle's Politics. It is kind of like a Cliff's Notes on the politics. It's not an interpretation. It's not like my other books, which are kind of interpretive books. This is more kind of a study guide. It's designed to kind of help you as a reader going through the politics text. Now you can get it at Lulu, or you can get it I think it's online available. Many distributing it, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and many other places. If you buy those, I don't. If you buy it by Lulu, I get the bookstore profit. Okay. If you buy it through them, I only get my cut that I get per the book. It's not much, okay, per book, but it's better than my other books per book. But it's still not much. But if you buy it through Lulu, it's pretty pit. It is a significant little chunk of change. Um, Again, not it's this book's it's $28, $27, $28. I understand it's so expensive. I was trying to get it to be under 20, but the inflation now is 20 is now 30 in that sense. Again, I a student who does it, if you already bought yourself a copy, you study the politics, you'd like to study the politics, or someone who's going to study politics, would be worth using, particularly those who want some guidance about how bibliography and things like that as well. The bibliography I borrowed from a friend. I got his permission to use it. The bibliography is only at the end. It's a kind of useful tool, but it's more designed the guides, the outlines, the structures to kind of grasp the text and get a handle on it. And I think that's really useful. Well, that's it. Next chapter, next time we meet, we'll finish the discussion of preservations, looking at chapter 9. On this, I will say goodbye and have a good